Luther, the father of the Protestant Reformation, is the one who actually wrote this song that we're going to be singing together today. So hopefully you have warmed your vocal cords up and you can hit the notes that Miss Karen may hit during this song. If it goes up, she's going.
You can always drop it a couple of octaves.
So
You'll do that on your own.
So we'll turn it over to you ladies. I'm sorry you just sat down. I'll turn it over to you as soon as you're ready.
Okay, let me get a little drink.
Otherwise, I'll be up here singing. It's not going to be good.
Good gracious.
I'm sorry.
Almighty fortress is our God, a bulwark never failing. Thank you. Our helper, He amid the flood of mortal life prevailing. For still our ancient foes must seek to work us woe. His craft and power are great, and armed with cruel hate. On earth is not His equal. To be in our own strength confined, our striving would be losing. Were not the right man on our side, the man of God's own choosing. Who that may be, Christ Jesus, it is He, Lord Sabaoth, His name, from age to age the same, and He must win the battle. That word above all earthly powers, no thanks to them abideth. The Spirit and the gifts are ours, through Him who with us sideth. Let goods and kindred go, mortal life also, the body they may kill, God's truth abideth still, His kingdom is forever. Thank you, guys. Thank you.
And ladies and gentlemen, next up we have Miss Donna Watts, the Joker 2. Maybe a little bit of inspiration to go along with it.
Okay, these are several little short jokes, and then my inspiration is a little bit long, but I love the story, so I'm going to share it with you guys. One, it says, don't get excited now, ran out of toilet paper and now using lettuce leaves. Today was just the tip of the iceberg. Tomorrow remains to be seen. Be sure to bring politics at Thanksgiving dinner. It's going to save you a lot of money at Christmas gifts. Okay, now this is the story. It's a little long, but it's a really beautiful story. It's about 3 trees. Oh, this thing's moving. Once there was 3 trees on a hill in the woods. They were discussing their hopes and their dreams when the first tree said, "Someday I hope to be a treasure chest. I could be filled with gold and silver and precious gems. I could be decorated with beautiful carvings, and everyone would see my beauty." Then the second tree said, "Someday I will be a mighty ship. I will take kings and queens across the waters and sail to the corners of the world. Everyone will feel safe in me because of the strength of my hull." Finally, the third tree said, I want to grow to be the tallest and straightest tree in the forest. People will see me on top of the hill and look up to my branches and think of the heavens and God and how close to them I am reaching. I will be the greatest tree of all times, and people will always remember me. After a few years of praying that their dreams would come true, a group of woodsmen came into the forest upon the trees. When one came to the first tree, he said, this looks like a strong tree. I think I should be able to sell this wood to a carpenter. And he began cutting it down. The tree was happy because he knew that the carpenter would make him a treasure chest. The second tree and the woodsman said, this looks like a strong tree. I should be able to sell it to the shipyard. The second tree was very happy because he knew he was on his way to becoming a mighty ship. When the woodsman came upon the third tree, the tree was frightened because he knew that if they cut him down, his dreams would not come true. One of the woodsmen says, I don't need anything special from my tree. I'll take this one, and he cut it down. When the first tree arrived at the carpenter, he was made into a feed box for animals. He was then placed in a barn and filled with hay. This was not at all what he prayed for. The second tree was cut and made into a small fishing boat. His dream was to be a mighty ship and carry kings had come to the end. The third tree was cut down into large pieces and left alone in the dark. The years went by and trees forgot about their dreams. Then one day, a man and a woman came to the barn. She gave birth, and they placed the baby in the hay in the feed box that was made from the first tree. The man wished that he could have made a crib for the baby, but this manger would have to do. The tree could feel the importance of this event and knew that it had held the greatest treasure of all times. Years later, a group of men got in a fishing boat made for the second tree. One of them was tired and went to sleep. While they were out on the water, a great storm arose, and the tree didn't think it was strong enough to keep the men safe. The men woke the sleeping man, and he stood and said, peace, and the storm stopped. At this time, the tree knew that he had carried the kings of kings in the boat. Finally, someone came out and got the third tree. It was carried through the street as the people mocked the man who was carrying it. When they came to the stop, the man was nailed to the tree and raised in the air to die on the top of the hill. When Sunday came, the tree came to realize it was strong enough to stand at the top of the hill and be as close to God as it could possibly be, because Jesus had been crucified on it. The moral of the story is that when things don't seem to be going your way, always know that God has a plan for you. If you place your trust in him, God will give you great gifts. Each of these trees got what they wanted. They just did not get it the way they wanted it. We don't always know what God's plans are for us, but we do know that his ways are not our ways, but his ways are the best ways. And one other little thing, it says, God has a reason for allowing things to happen. We may never understand his wisdom, but we simply have to trust his will.
Yeah, I appreciate that story. It's definitely a great way of just turning perspective around and giving you some insight on you're not always aware of what things are coming or what things can amount to in the end for us and God's plan for us. And so in this life we're in, and in my line of work, I run into people who are going through difficult circumstances, and you'd like to be able to assure that things are going to get better and things like that, but that's really outside of our control in a lot of circumstances. But what I often try to do is just remind people to look backwards and to see what God has done for them to this point, and letting that be a reminder and an assurance of how God is still working, and some things that we may not see in the future because God has not enabled us to see the future. That's one way we develop faith, is by not being able to know all these things for ourselves. In order to get that kind of assurance, then it helps us to look back and see where God has been faithful. And I think he has been. I think in this room there's lots of stories of God's faithfulness through difficult circumstances. So here we are. We've made it to this point. All of your life has amounted to this moment that we have together at this time. So glad you can make it today. And glad we could be together. We are in the book of Acts, and we are actually going to start into chapter 25. We're trying to get Paul to Rome. Paul's been trying to get to Rome for a while now, and as we just saw in that story, the way you think you may be getting somewhere may be very different than what you anticipated. And so we see this happening in Paul's life. As all this trouble began way back in Jerusalem a couple years ago, if you remember. We weren't in it a couple years ago, but for Paul, there was a riot that broke out in Jerusalem, if you remember. And they were accusing Paul of taking this Gentile into the temple and speaking against the temple and the Old Testament law. Of course, these are the Judaizers, the ones who wanted people to go back to the old ways of ritual ceremony in Old Testament law. And from that, this riot breaks out from these people who are stirring up the crowd. And these same people vow to continue to follow Paul from one place to another to see that he no longer does what he's doing, which is preaching the gospel. In fact, they want to end his life. And so these guys are motivated. They've been doing this for a couple of years now. And even after Paul was arrested and he was sent to trial, you have these men who are taking an oath not to eat or drink until Paul dies, and they try to arrange for Paul to have this transfer where they ambush him, and then Paul's cousin or nephew finds out about it, and therefore Paul finds out and lets Felix know, hey, this is about to happen, and Paul's life is spared all that way. But you see the motivation of those who were opposing Paul all throughout this time. And so now we are kind of in the middle of all of these trials. You see a little bit of a parallel between the end of Jesus' ministry and also the end of Paul's public ministry as it goes from one trial to another, all these false accusations coming from those who should have known Paul, who should have known what his mission is about the quickest, but they refused to believe, much like the Sanhedrin refused to believe when Jesus was proclaiming to be the Messiah. So, we're in chapter 25. If you do have your folder, what page of notes are we on? So everybody, 34. Page 34. So where we left off, we see Paul is being handed over from Felix to Festus. So Festus is now coming in, and he's not going to stay very long. But Felix was the one that had Paul under house arrest. Felix had the wife who was a Jew, knew a little bit about Judaism, and was asking Paul a bunch of questions and seemed like he was just delaying. And it says in Scripture that he was actually waiting for a bribe. You know, if Paul could just pay a little bit of money, then things would speed up for him and he could just either be released or whatever. But that doesn't work. And eventually Felix is replaced by Festus. And now Paul is facing Festus, who doesn't have as much familiarity with Jewish ways and things like that Felix had. So that's where we pick it up. And we're going to read the first 5 verses as we go through Acts 25. 3 days after arriving in the province, Festus went up from Caesarea to Jerusalem. Okay, so right now Paul is in house arrest in Caesarea. That's where Felix was meeting with him. Now Festus is in charge in Caesarea. Now Festus is moving on to Jerusalem, where the chief priests and Jewish leaders appeared before him and presented the charges against Paul. They urgently requested Festus as a favor to them to have Paul transferred to Jerusalem, for they were preparing an ambush to kill him along the way. Sounds familiar? Festus answered, Paul is being held at Caesarea, and I myself am going there soon. Let some of your leaders come with me and press charges against the man there, if he has done anything wrong. All right, so here's some blanks here. The new leader would naturally pay a visit to the Jews in order to be on their good side. If you remember, the Romans established these puppet leaders or rulers in these areas, and their main job is to keep peace. and to keep taxes flowing back to Rome. And so, when Festus is there, one of the first things he wants to do is go and meet with these power brokers in this area of Caesarea and Jerusalem and make sure that peace is being kept, and he's on their good side. So that's why he travels to Jerusalem. And then we see the Jews' hatred, that's a blank, hatred of Paul had not subsided over the 2-year period that he was in house arrest with Felix. So the same plot, I guess these guys probably ate some food in the last 2 years, but the same plot is at foot here, where they want to have Paul transferred in one way or another to ambush and to try and to kill Paul. So they're asking for Paul to come to Jerusalem so the Sanhedrin can make their case against Paul there. And Festus is saying that's not how we do things. If you want to take somebody to court, you got to go to court. Court's not coming to you. So he's saying if you like to make an accusation, travel to them. So that's why Festus refused. He's asserting authority there. And he may have already been aware of the conspiracy against Paul. Maybe Felix had passed that down in his notes from one leader to another as Felix was replaced. So it continues in verse 6. It says, after spending 8 or 10 days with them, he went down to Caesarea, and the next day he convened the court and ordered that Paul be brought before him. When Paul appeared, the Jews who had come down from Jerusalem stood around him, bringing many serious charges against him, which they could not prove. Then Paul made his defense. I've done nothing wrong against the law of the Jews, or against the temple, or against Caesar. Festus, wishing to do the Jews a favor, said to Paul, are you willing to go up to Jerusalem and stand trial before me there on these charges? Paul answered, I'm now standing before Caesar's court, where I ought to be tried. I have not done anything wrong to the Jews, as you yourself know very well. If, however, I am guilty of doing anything deserving death, I do not refuse to die. But if the charges brought against me by these Jews are not true, no one has the right to hand me over to them. I appeal to Caesar. So this is a big statement he's making here. We'll talk about it for a second. Here are a couple of blanks. Paul knew of the Jewish plot that awaited him in Jerusalem. Okay, so the trial is happening in Caesarea. None of the charges brought against Paul are making any sense. Paul's defending himself, and he's saying, I've not broken Jewish law, I've not broken Roman law, I've not created any kind of a riot. And if anything, I was in Jerusalem in the temple to perform vows as a Jew so that I wouldn't offend Jewish people. And that's when this riot had begun. So he's explaining all of this stuff over and over again to these people. And then Festus asks, hey, would you like to travel and defend yourself in Jerusalem? Well, Paul already knows what this is all about. And so it's at that point he appeals to Caesar, which would have been an instant, do not pass go, do not collect 200, on to the Supreme Court there to have his trial heard in Rome. So, using the rights, that's a blank, of a Roman citizen, he appealed to the Supreme Court. I appeal to Caesar. When you do that, the stakes go higher, right? So if you're going to appeal to the Supreme Court of the land, these are some bloodthirsty governors that are taking place here. We're talking about Rome. They put people on crosses here. And Paul himself is saying, if this means I'm going to die, then I will die. But I'm not going to be handed over to these people. So he's appealing to Caesar as a result of that. And maybe Paul saw God's way of getting him to Rome. Been wanting to go to Rome all along. And this is a way to get there. But it's in chains. He's still going to be getting to Rome. And though it's a winding road, God's will still is accomplished in ways that we would oftentimes least expect. All right, so now Festus has a job to do. He's got to prepare the case so that when it goes to Rome, to Caesar, Festus isn't embarrassing himself as to how little he understands about what's actually happening here with Paul. So he's going to try to put everything together in such a way that politically he looks good to Caesar, and that's what we're going to read about verses 13 to 22. A few days after King Agrippa and Bernice arrived at Caesarea to pay their respects to Festus, right? He's the new ruler in town. You got the local rulers coming around, kissing rings. It's a big to-do, parades, everything. Since they were spending many days there, Festus discussed Paul's case with the king. He said, "There's a man here whom Felix left as a prisoner. When I went to Jerusalem, the chief priests and elders of the Jews brought charges against him and asked that he be condemned. I told them that it's not the Roman custom to hand over any man before he has faced his accusers and has had an opportunity to defend himself against their charges. When they came here with me, I did not delay the case, but convened the court in the next day and ordered the man to be brought in. When his accusers got up to speak, they did not charge him with any of the crimes I had expected. Instead, they had some points of dispute with him about their own religion and about a dead man named Jesus who Paul claimed was alive. I was at a loss how to investigate such matters, so I asked if he would be willing to go to Jerusalem and stand trial there on these charges. When Paul made his appeal to be held over for the emperor's decision, I ordered him held until I could send him to Caesar. Then Agrippa said to Festus, I would like to hear this man for myself. He replied, tomorrow you will hear him. Okay. So, you have the request. Agrippa was actually a Jew. So that's probably why Festus thought it worthwhile to talk about the details of what's happening with Paul to Agrippa, because he might have some insight on these religious charges and this dead man whom Paul is saying is alive. So he's trying to figure all that out. Agrippa and Bernice are children of Herod. This was the Herod that was eaten by worms. You remember that guy in chapter 12, verse 23? He was allowing people to worship him, and he had this nice, bright, shiny robe. This is why you never see me at any point wearing sequins or anything like that, because I'm looking out for worms. Right. There's a long line of bad Herods, right? You don't name your son Herod because there's a long line of bad ones there, and this is Agrippa is a descendant of these guys. So the case was a matter of religion, not civil law, as Festus was explaining. Festus of the Adams family. I can't stop thinking about
Festus and Gunsmoke.
Gunsmoke. I didn't realize there was a Festus and Gunsmoke. Oh, and both, yeah. Yeah, I think it's Uncle Festus, the bald guy in Adam's family. That's a little bit closer to what I remember. So you have Agrippa's family there that's explained the infamous contact with Christianity. Great-grandfather is the one who was actually seeking out this child who was born in Bethlehem and wiped out all of the babies, the male kids in Jerusalem. And then you had his uncle who executed John the Baptist, was beheaded in order to watch this younger family member dance in front of him. That's a crazy story that we see in the Gospels. And then you have Agrippa's father was the one who executed James and had imprisoned Peter earlier in the book of Acts. So this is the background on this guy that's visiting with Festus.
Excuse me.
Yes, ma'am.
I missed a blank, I'm sorry. The case was a matter of religion, not
Civil law.
civil law. Thank you.
Yeah. So it would not be typical for the Romans to have to deal with this. This is something that the Sanhedrin would have typically taken care of ahead of time, figured it out amongst themselves. But because this is one of those life and death things that the leaders, the Sanhedrin, are not just trying to imprison Paul. That doesn't work. The past few times they've imprisoned Paul, somehow he's gotten out. They can't figure out how or why. So they're trying to put him to death. Well, to put him to death, that takes Roman authority, and this is not going so well. The Romans are like, we don't know what to do with him. So that's where we are. It continues as now you see Paul make his case before Agrippa. Verse 23 to the end of the chapter. The next day, Agrippa and Bernice came with great pomp and entered the audience room with the high-ranking officers and the leading men of the city. At the command of Festus, Paul was brought in. Festus said, "King Agrippa and all who are present with us, you see this man. The whole Jewish community has petitioned me about him in Jerusalem and here in Caesarea, shouting that he ought not to live any longer. I found that he'd done nothing deserving of death, but because he made his appeal to the emperor, I decided to send him to Rome. But I have nothing definite to write to his majesty about him. Therefore, I've brought him before all of you, and especially before you, King Agrippa, so that as a result of this investigation, I may have something to write. For I think it is unreasonable to send on a prisoner without specifying the charges against him." Doesn't that just sound weird? It's like we can't figure out what to charge this man, and now he's going to Supreme Court, and we're still trying to figure out what to say about him. So that means Festus was in a dilemma, which is the blank there. Yes, so that's the situation. Festus is this new king of Judea. He's under the Roman emperor. He's trying to make a decent impression. He's got to deal with this uprising that's big enough that he can't just kind of hide it and say, well, you guys just need to get over it, figure it out amongst yourselves. That's not working. So he's caught in between the Caesar and also this groundswell of Jewish folks that want to see Paul put to death. And so Agrippa knows about so much of this background, the prophets and the Jewish faith. And so we're going to see how intrigued he is by Paul and what Paul's about to say. So here it is, chapter 26. "Then Agrippa said to Paul, 'You have permission to speak for yourself.' So Paul motioned with his hand, which would have been kind of a technique that's used. It's like a public speaking thing. Instead of having a pulpit, they would motion with their hand. That means, okay, now he's going to make a presentation. Pay close attention to his defense. And he begins his defense. Verse 2, "King Agrippa, I consider myself fortunate to stand before you today as I make my defense against all the accusations of the Jews, and especially so because you are well acquainted with all the Jewish customs and controversies. Therefore, I beg you to listen to me patiently." Okay, so as bad a dude as this guy is, or at least his family members are, Paul still uses some wisdom here, shrewd as a snake, and complimenting. This is how you would make a defense before a court. You honor the judge and such, and so he's doing this. And he's motioning with his hand in an orator's position, even though he was in chains. So you picture that. Paul is trying to present himself almost as if there's no lawyers in this case. He's the lawyer for himself, and he's in chains trying to make his defense. This was not flattery. Agrippa should be able to understand Paul's situation. So Paul is addressing Agrippa in this way, and then he starts to make his defense. So we'll just read straight through that, and then we'll hit a couple of blanks as we go from there. "The Jews all know the way I've lived ever since I was a child, from the beginning of my life in my own country and also in Jerusalem. They've known me for a long time and can testify, if they are willing, that according to the strictest sect of our religion, I lived as a Pharisee. And now it's because of my hope in what God has promised our fathers that I am on trial today. This is the promise our 12 tribes are hoping to see fulfilled as they earnestly serve God day and night. O King, it is because of this hope that the Jews are accusing me. Why should any of you consider it incredible that God raises the dead?" All right, so keep in mind, these people who are accusing Paul knew Paul from an early age, as he was being trained by Gamaliel as a young student to being one of the top Pharisees, even involved in the Sanhedrin during the time of Stephen's martyrdom. Paul is addressing all of this, and he's pointing the finger at all these people and saying, these people know who I am, they know what my zeal for the law was, and they should be the first to know about the ability that God has to raise the dead. The accusation right now, the religious accusation, is that that Paul is preaching a dead man who is alive, and that being Jesus. And so verse 9, "I too was convinced that I ought to do all that was possible to oppose the name of Jesus of Nazareth. And that is just what I did in Jerusalem. On the authority of the chief priest, I put many of the saints in prison, and when they were put to death, I cast my vote against them. So that makes Paul not just someone who arrested, but also murdered Christians in voting for them to be put to death, okay? Many a time I went from one synagogue to another to have them punished, and I tried to force them to blaspheme. In my obsession against them, I even went to foreign cities to persecute them. These are people accusing Paul who have traveled from one town to another to try and stop Paul from doing what he's doing. And Paul is basically pointing the finger back to them and saying, I know what that was like. I used to do that. And Paul continues, on one of these journeys, I was going to Damascus with the authority and commission of the chief priests. About noon, O king, as I was on the road, I saw a light from heaven, brighter than the sun, blazing around me and my companions. We all fell to the ground, and I heard a voice saying to me in Aramaic, Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me? It is hard for you to kick against the goads. If you remember, the account of Luke on Saul's conversion in Acts chapter 9 gives you one perspective. Now Paul is giving you his perspective as he experienced it on the road to Damascus. And so you have a little bit more insight onto how this sudden change and transformation happened in Paul's life. And one phrase that's included here that's not included in Luke's earlier account is Jesus saying, why do you kick against the goads? Which is a metaphorical or a visual illustration that in that time they would have understood fairly easily as opposed to today. That's not something we see very often, which is a shepherd who is using a crook or a stick to push an animal forward, or even a farmer using this as well. So it's kind of a pointy stick that's used to push an animal forward. And Jesus is using this and saying, Paul, I'm pushing you towards something. Why are you kicking against it? Now, the context of all of this is what Paul is just now talking about and his zeal for persecuting. And if you remember, we talked about this back earlier in Acts, how detailed Luke's account of his conversion was, which had to come from Paul's eyewitness testimony, and how detailed Luke's account of Stephen's martyrdom was. Stephen's whole speech before the Sanhedrin, recounting all of the Old Testament stories, pointing towards Jesus and all of that, before he's dragged out into the streets of Jerusalem and put to death, was detailed almost word for word, as if Paul, years later, would have remembered by detail what Stephen said right before he participated in Stephen's martyrdom. That, in my opinion, was the goad that Paul kicked against. It was his conscience that was constantly coming after him as to how he persecuted not just Stephen, but even those before him that he described right here in this account. God's using Paul's zeal for the law and his persecution as a way to convict him of sin and help him turn to Christ. But Paul had been resisting that. And then Jesus shows up and says, why are you persecuting me? Why are you kicking against the goads? So here's what Paul is talking about here. And it's just a remarkable account of seeing Paul's transformation and his salvation, even though he's just simply testifying in this court. There's so much more behind these words that we can see in hindsight, knowing all of the account that Luke records in Acts. In verse 15, he says, I asked, who are you, Lord? I am Jesus, whom you are persecuting, the Lord replied. Now get up, stand on your feet. I have appeared to you to appoint you as a servant and as a witness of what you have seen of me and what I will show you. I will rescue you from your own people and from the Gentiles. I'm sending you to them to open their eyes and to turn them from darkness to light and from the power of Satan to God, so that they may receive forgiveness of sins and a place among those who are sanctified by faith in me. So then, King Agrippa, I was not disobedient to the vision from heaven, first to those in Damascus, then to those in Jerusalem and all Judea, and to the Gentiles also. So here is the recounting of Jesus' great commission, and Paul saying, I'm doing this, what Jesus has said. I preach that they should repent and turn to God and prove their repentance by their deeds. That's why the Jews seized me in the temple courts and tried to kill me. But I've had God's help to this very day, and so I stand here and testify to small and great alike, right? So Paul looking back, I've seen God working to this point, and this is why I can now stand in front of you or anybody else and be able to say the same thing that I continue to say about who Jesus is and the change that's happened in my life. I'm saying nothing beyond what the prophets and Moses said would happen, that the Christ would suffer and as the first to rise from the dead would proclaim light to his people and to the Gentiles. At this point, Festus interrupted Paul's defense. "You are out of your mind, Paul," he shouted. "Your great learning is driving you insane." "I'm not insane, most excellent Festus," Paul replied. "Uncle Festus, what I'm saying is true and reasonable. The king is familiar with these things, and I can speak freely to him. I'm convinced that none of this has escaped his notice, because it is not done in a corner. King Agrippa, do you believe the prophets? I know you do." Then Agrippa said to Paul, "Do you think that in such a short time you can persuade me to be a Christian?" Paul replied, "Short time or long, I pray God that not only you, but all those who are listening to me today may become what I am, except for these chains." This is so beautiful, right? It's just a drama that's taking place between these people. The king rose, and with him the governor and Bernice and those sitting with them. They left the room, and while talking, those sitting with him, they left the room, and while talking with one another, they said, "This man is not doing anything that deserves death or imprisonment." Agrippa said to Festus, "This man could have been set free if he had not appealed to Caesar." All right. So, quite a, once you get a picture of just the long story of Paul's conversion and his work in preaching to the Gentiles, and then you have Agrippa's background with all of his family persecuting, the church and all of these Christian leaders for generations, and Paul now facing this guy and saying, "I wish you should know better, and I wish you were like me, except for these chains, that you would come to know Christ, and that you would fully respond to what God has presented to you through the death of all of these people that have come before me." So quite a remarkable testimony before the court and to King Agrippa. So here's a couple of blanks that we had in there from verses 1 through 3. I think I already gave you that. 4 through 8, still on trial because of his belief in the resurrection. Then when you go down to verse 24, where you have the interchange between Festus and Paul and Agrippa. Paul confronted Agrippa with a decision about his own soul. So he's asking for him to come forward right then and there, be baptized in the name of the Lord Jesus Christ, forgiveness of sins, get the Holy Spirit. But Agrippa was not going to go for that. Agrippa uses the term Christian in his sarcasm, which would have been a term of derision, derisiveness in that time, which started in Antioch, which is when some of the persecution started against Christians. They were called little Christs or Christians. Paul's going to preach the gospel in any circumstance. I mean, he was doing that while he was bloody in front of the crowd that had just beaten him in Caesarea Philippi. So you just have the same MO, and Paul's just going to keep doing that because that's what it's about at this point for his life. But Paul is not just trying to upset people. He's not just trying to do a Jerry Springer in front of all these folks, right? He is appealing to evidence, right? He's appealing to reason. He's talked about the law and the prophets, and he's also talking about the evidence of the resurrection in terms of who's available to testify and see what has taken place. So he's seizing opportunities as he goes, and he's using the powers that God has given him to preach the gospel in this circumstance. And then after all of that, you do have these leaders saying, "We're not even sure why Paul's going to Rome in the first place. Like, this isn't the kind of trial you send to the Supreme Court. This could have very easily been figured out and taken care of here." But the problem is, I think all the way back to Felix. Felix would have let Paul go. He would have given him, kind of pardoned him or whatever, even without a bribe, had that taken care of the uprising of the Jewish people in that area. If these guys would have freed Paul, even there in Jerusalem or in Caesarea, this problem wasn't going away with these people shouting for Paul's death. And Rome would have had to continually respond to this issue. So he's going to Rome, and they are still at a loss as to how to really present the case to Caesar in the court there. So let's pick up a little bit. We've got some time left. So let's go into chapter 27. And this will put us on a good track to hopefully finish Acts next week. And then we're going to start into the life of David, which is another just remarkable account. Lots of parallel between Jesus and David, just like we just saw here with Jesus and Paul towards the end of his life. So be part of that. I think we'll be in the life of David probably through the winter, because there's a lot there that we'll be able to study. So, chapter 27, verses 1 through 3. When it was decided that we would sail for Italy, Paul and some other, did you guys catch that? So, Luke's there. Paul and some other prisoners were handed over to a centurion named Julius, who belonged to the imperial regiment. We boarded a ship from that place, about to sail for ports along the coast of the province of Asia, and we put out to sea. Aristarchus, a Macedonian from Thessalonica, was with us. The next day we landed at Sidon, and Julius, in kindness to Paul, allowed him to go to his friends so they might provide for his needs. Okay, so Aristarchus had traveled with Paul to Jerusalem previously in chapter 20. And so this is someone that would be an encouragement to Paul. And Paul needed lots of encouragement in this time. You'll see, as we've talked about before, during his imprisonments, writing letters like Philippians and such, you can see kind of Paul's frame of mind. I think Paul, you've heard of the love languages and such. Paul's love language was just quality time, I think. And just to be able to see people that he had been ministering alongside of, even during his imprisonment, was a blessing. So then you have the we passages starting up again, signifying that Luke was with Paul for his journey. Julius is a kind centurion that allows Paul to visit believers in Sidon while the ship was in port. And I think to Paul that would have been a blessing. Yes.
Could you go over those again?
Yes. Aristarchus had traveled with Paul to Jerusalem previously. And then the we passages start up again, signifying that Luke was with Paul for this part of his journey, which of course would have been an encouragement for Paul. And then Julius is a centurion. He's the soldier, the ranking officer in charge of making sure Paul gets to his location, and he allows Paul to visit with believers in Sidon, which would have put him in a little bit of a risk when you think about how high profile this prisoner really is. Journey continues from Sidon to Myra, verses 4 through 6. We'll get to verse 15, I think, and then try to close it up together. All right, so chapter 27, verses 4 through 15. Here we go. From there, we put out to sea again and passed to the lee of Cyprus because the winds were against us. When we had sailed across the open sea off the coast of Cilicia and Pamphylia, we landed at Myra in Lycia. You guys want to read these next few verses? Luke, the ever attentive to detail kind of guy, is going to list every spot, which is great because now we have lots of really cool Bible maps. If you got one of those Bibles that has maps in them, you'll see Paul's journeys bouncing around from one place to another on the way to Rome. There the centurion found an Alexandrian ship sailing for Italy and put us on board. We made slow headway for many days and had difficulty arriving off of Cnidus. When the wind did not allow us to hold our course, we sailed to the lee of Crete, opposite Salmone. We moved along the coast with difficulty and came to a place called Fair Havens near the town of Lacia. Much time had been lost, and sailing had already become dangerous because by now it was after the fast. So Paul warned them, "Men, I can see that our voyage is going to be disastrous and bring great loss to ship and cargo, and to our own lives also." But the centurion, instead of listening to what Paul said, followed the advice of the pilot and of the owner of the ship. Since the harbor was unsuitable to winter in, the majority decided that we should sail on, hoping to reach Phoenix and winter there. This was a harbor in Crete, facing both southwest and northeast. When a gentle south wind began to blow, they thought they had obtained what they wanted. So they weighed anchor and sailed along the shore of Crete. Before very long, a wind of hurricane force, called the northeaster, swept down from the island. The ship was caught by storm and could not head into the wind, so we gave way to it and were driven along. Okay, so, even Rome, as big a place as it is, didn't have like every ship that it needed to send people from one place to another. So when you had a centurion who's responsible for transporting soldiers or prisoners or any of those kinds of things, part of their job is to work with merchant vessels, like sail ships and shipping types of ships to get from one place to another based on weather. They didn't have wavy Doppler 10. They couldn't predict which is going to be the safest way, things like that. So it's just very much about opportunity and trying to make decisions as you went. And that's kind of where we're seeing things happen here as they're bouncing from one place to another, based on this huge storm that's coming through in that time and all these little storms that are coming ahead of it. So this is the recounting of how this journey is taking place, which I would have to say may have some type of a spiritual significance to it as well. Paul getting to Rome is a big deal. So you have the journey from Sidon to Myra. The lee is a side of the land that shelters from the wind. So that's where you see that term showing up over and over again. And you have these areas where the hills are kind of like facing the water, and they're trying to get around that side of the hill that blocks the wind. They went around Cyprus. This was a longer route, but the winds were against them. So wind in both of those blanks. And then they go from Myra around Crete. Normally this trip would only take 1 day. But it is going to take them a little bit longer. And then Paul gives them this ominous warning about danger. And we'll talk more about this next time, about how all this stuff works together. But they're on their way, and they have to go to this place called Fair Havens, which is out in the boonies. Boonies, boonies. Out in the sticks. That's a acceptable word for that blank as well. So they're in the middle of nowhere. This is not normally a stop for merchant vessels and such, but they're trying to avoid this storm. And Lacia was at least a 2-hour walk, so now they've stopped there. They're trying to go to this other place, hook up with another ship. It's already October, and the winter is coming fast, so they're running out of time to sail. Winter is coming fast. I felt it this morning. My wife, for some reason, is keeping the windows open and has not cut the heat on in my house. So, hence, this is what you're hearing right now. So Paul's advice was his own opinion, not revelation from God, yet the majority wanted to keep going. Paul's advice was his own opinion, not revelation from God. Paul thinks this is what's going to happen. He's actually going to get a vision from God on what's about to happen, which is different from what Paul's opinion was. The majority are saying, look, we can handle this, we can keep going, we've got to get to this place before winter sets in. So Paul knows of the risks. He's had these types of situations before. He recounts them in 2 Corinthians 11, 25, where he talks about how he has been in 3 different types of shipwreck situations. So Paul is familiar with what this would look like, and he's like, this is not going to go well if we keep going. So Phoenix was only about 40 miles away. So in favorable conditions would have taken 3 to 4 hours. But we're not going to see favorable conditions. So the storm comes about, verses 13 through 15, which is the big one, the nor'easter. So it's a hurricane in that part of the world. And the ship is at the mercy of the storm at this point. Now it's just trying to keep it above water and then figure out where you are once the storm's over and go to where you got to get, because there's no way to control the ship at this point. And so we're going to leave it there and pick it up next week and figure out, does Paul get to Rome or not? Does he survive the storm or not? So stay tuned. Same bat time, same bat channel. And we will finish up the book of Acts next week, Lord willing, and the storms don't rise. But even if they do, a mighty fortress is our God, a bulwark never failing. See how I brought it all back together, all around in the end? There you go. All right. Thank you all for your time and attention today. Hopefully you got a little bit of an insight onto the drama that's happening towards the end of the book of Acts here. And the hits are going to keep coming next week. So hopefully we'll see you next week. Before we close everything up, I'll mention a few things that we should be praying for